He came face to face with many people he had harmed and apologized. It's an incredible story because not only did he then commit to going back and engaging in that community in constructive ways, but he actually became a member of the Fambul Tok staff and began to work with other ex-combatants using his own story to help them come to terms with the harms they had inflicted.
I'm your host, Eileen Boris, and I'd like to welcome you to Political Forgiveness Voices of Peace, a podcast of hope where forgiveness and political forgiveness intersect to create a better world. I am so thrilled to introduce my guest today, Libby Hoffman, founder and president of Catalyst for Peace, a private granting and operating foundation where Libby has pioneered an inside-out approach to peace and development. She co-founded Fambul Tok, which means family talk in Creole, in Sierra Leone, and has accompanied its growth from the post-war community reconciliation to a national policy framework, which she has written about in her book, The Answers Are There, Building Peace from the Inside Out, and in her award-winning documentary film, Fambul Tok, which she produced in 2011. To my listeners, I highly recommend Libby's book and documentary. Both are inspiring, insightful, and will touch your heart. Welcome, Libby.
Thank you so much. I'm such to be here.
I'm just so touched by your work and the spirituality you bring to it. And when I was reading your book, you shared some of that. Your work is so spiritually inspired, and how much I really, really appreciate that and appreciate you for that. So I wanted to share that, and I wanted my listeners to know that about you. When I first heard about your work, it was because of Fambul Tok. And I was very, very impressed with how Fambul Tok tapped into the storytelling culture and traditions of Sierra Leone, which also included forgiveness. So I'm wondering if you can provide the context of what was going on in Sierra Leone, which led to Fambul Tok, and your role in how Fambul Tok began.
Thank you. And thank you for starting with that spiritual appreciation. That's a beautiful foundation. One of the main ways that's impacted my perspective is a faith conviction that the answers are there, which is the name of my book, meaning the very communities most impacted are the ones that have answers and resources to address the problems that they're facing. And that's a faith conviction as much as anything else. And it's really impacted, grounded, and shaped everything that I do. And it shaped the way I went into Sierra Leone. And my colleague, John Cocker, the Sierra Leonean human rights advocate that I've worked with for the last now 18 years. And our work began in helping to chart a path of recovery from the Civil War and reconciliation at the community level. Sierra Leone had an 11-year civil war, and it was notorious for the use of things like amputation as a tool of war, sexual slavery, sexual assault, rape as a tool of war, the use of child soldiers. Most people who don't know anything about Sierra Leone have seen the movie Blood Diamonds. They have an image of the Civil War in Sierra Leone, largely from that movie. After this 11-year Civil War, there was an international tribunal, a special court, a joint venture between the international community and the government of Sierra Leone to prosecute, to try the 13 men deemed most responsible for the atrocities of that war. And from that, 9 people were convicted, including Charles Taylor, the former leader of Liberia. The court process cost over $500 million. There was also a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, modeled to some degree after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. This one lasted from 2002 to 2004. And the idea was to create a space where people could tell the stories of what happened and begin the process of healing and recovering from the wounds of the war. The challenges with the TRC process in Sierra Leone was most people didn't have access to participate. So first of all, in the peace treaties that ended the war, there was a blanket immunity given to all of the former perpetrators except those being charged in the special court. So they didn't have an impetus to tell their story because they had already received their immunity. And a lot of activists, including my colleague John Cocker, who was a renowned human rights advocate in Sierra Leone, had advocated for that process for immunity to come from their truth telling. And it didn't. A blanket amnesty had been given already. So very few people testified, unfortunately. In addition, the hearings for the TRC were held in ways where most people couldn't participate. They were in the capital cities of the districts over a short amount of time so that people who didn't have access to motorized transportation, who couldn't afford to be away from their work in the fields for a few days, couldn't get there and couldn't participate. In the war in Sierra Leone, there were over 50,000 deaths. Over 2 million people were displaced. The whole community is completely destroyed. That's a third of the population. 250,000 women were raped or subject to sexual slavery. Over 10,000 amputations, over 10,000 child soldiers. So the norm is that in these villages, people were living next door to somebody who might have killed their parent, who might have raped them, who might have burned down their house or amputated their arm or forced them at gunpoint to do one of those atrocities to somebody that they loved. And that's the norm. Nobody had talked about what had happened. In fact, the government's approach had been to just counsel people forgive and forget. Let's move on. But communities couldn't move on until there was some sort of process that could help them to do that. And my colleague, John Cocker, was a human rights advocate who had been one of the leaders of the truth and reconciliation process from a civil society perspective. And all along he'd advocated for a reconciliation process grounded in the communities, led by the people themselves, drawing on their own culture and tradition, and nobody would listen. He was in despair that there wouldn't be any forgiveness process, that there wouldn't be any real meaningful reconciliation, that the communities would be stuck in this limbo, unable to move forward. And that's when he and I met. I run a foundation, Catalyst for Peace, and our core commitment had been to finding and creating the space for the people who are most impacted by violence and wars to lead in addressing challenges. We wanted to magnify that by gathering the stories and sharing them in meaningful ways, making the stories of what was possible in these cultures and communities known more generally around the world. And it was on that kind of a story gathering process. In spite of all of this, there's this beautiful culture of forgiveness in Sierra Leone, so many wonderful stories of forgiveness. And my colleagues were there leading a program for us, trying to document some of these stories when they met John Cocker and discovered he was just about ready to give up, that there would ever be real reconciliation in his country. When my colleague asked him, you've had a special court, you've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what more do you want? And he outlined his vision. We need a process that's at the local level, drawing on our culture and our tradition that ordinary people can not only participate in, but they can lead. And she said, you need to talk to Libby. And John happened to be coming to Columbia University. We talked on the phone first, and then I brought him up. I'm based in Maine in the United States. Brought him up here for a day to talk. We discovered this incredible alignment in our visions and decided to work together to create this program that became Fambul Tok. We first spoke in September, met in October, finalized a grant agreement and an initial program outline in November, and he went back in December to begin implementing it. This was in 2007. John knew there was this powerful tradition in Sierra Leone called Fambul Tok, family talk, gathering around the bonfire in front of the community, telling the truth about what happened, acknowledging the wrong, offering and accepting forgiveness. It's this powerful restorative justice process. And John knew that this could be adapted to address something as horrible as post-war reconciliation, the wounds of the Civil War. That's the vision that prompted us to work together. How do you create a space in the villages for people to draw on their own culture and tradition to come together and to heal.
How did communities prepare for those evening bonfire ceremonies? And what took place during those bonfires?
Yeah, the preparation is the core part of the work.
Mm-hmm.
If you watch the Fambul Tok film, you'll see lots of footage of the ceremonies. They're beautiful, powerful, and central. But the reality is it took 3 to 4 months of work in each community to lead up to that ceremony. Fambul Tok as an organization didn't facilitate the process. They created the space for communities to come together to ask, well, first of all, if they wanted to reconcile, but universally everybody did. How they wanted to do it, what resources they had, and how Fambul Tok could help in that process. They had communities put together committees of the most trusted folks in that community who could be there after the ceremony to help shepherd new conflicts or misunderstandings that might arise, and who would be the ones to lead in the planning and implementing of the ceremony. And they had youth committees that mobilized everybody to go out and let everybody know that this was happening. So the planning was a process that actually wove the community back together. It created the space for them to relearn how to work together, to define their own agenda, and to do their own decision making so that they could be the ones to plan and implement the process. Because that's what would make it owned by them and therefore sustainable and real.
Sounds like that's where the healing began with the communities.
Yes, exactly. The visual metaphor we use is that the community is like a cup. And whatever problem they're facing, the aid comes like water pouring into the cup. You pour the water into the cup, thinking, oh, this will solve that problem, right? It goes right through because the cup is cracked. And nobody even sees the cup, much less the cracks in the cup. They just keep pouring more water, which makes the cracks bigger. Fambul Tok's work wasn't about pouring water, it was about repairing the cup. The community holding these issues. If I'm living next door to somebody who's raped me or burned down my house or hurt one of my family members, there is no way that we can go forward either individually or as a community without addressing the truth of what happened.
So the preparation is the community coming together to talk about how to address this. And that was the first part of the preparation.
The second part was planning the ceremony itself. So the ceremony is two-part. There's a bonfire ceremony. This is what's evolved based on the experience of the communities. Because the tradition is coming together around the bonfire as a whole community, that was the centerpiece of where this reconciliation ceremony was going to take place. And then the next day was a cleansing ceremony, drawing on Sierra Leone culture and tradition. It was all run by community members. They appointed volunteers who were trusted by them to facilitate. The rule was you couldn't be prosecuted for your testimony, and it had to be in front of the whole community. And the communities prepared it. They had to gather the wood for the bonfire, and that's actually a scarce commodity. It took a lot of wood and a lot of work to do it. Fambul Tok might help contribute to food for a community feast, but other than that, the communities had to gather all of these resources themselves so that they would really own it, because that was really what sustained the healing. In the bonfire ceremony itself, the people who had been running that process in the districts would just explain what it was, what Fambul Tok was, what these ceremonies were, that you couldn't be prosecuted, and how much lightening of the burden there would be if you came forward to tell your story of either what happened to you in the war or what you did. And then the local community leaders would run the ceremonies and invite people to come forward. And the thing that was astonishing is how many people did immediately.
What struck me when I was watching the documentary was how the victim would share their horrific story, and then the perpetrator did come forward, but there was a lot of anger at first.
Yeah.
But how quickly they were able to let go of that anger. Can you give some insight into that?
Sure. There is culture of forgiveness in Sierra Leone. There's a real understanding of the importance of community. And if I hurt you, it's considered that I haven't just hurt you, I've hurt your family. And the flip side of that, in order to heal, it isn't just about us repairing our relationship. We need to actually make the community whole again. So we don't have peace until we make the community whole again. There's an understanding also that the worst form of punishment is actually having to tell the truth in front of the community to acknowledge the harm that you've caused in front of the community. Naming and shaming is felt as a really hard thing and a really hard punishment. And now you are accountable to the whole community and not just the person that you wronged for not harming them again and for helping to be a contributing, positive citizen again. The community is obligated to both ensure that happens and protect the victim from any kind of recurrence. So you've brought in this whole resource of the community. So in the bonfire, it was oftentimes the perpetrators that were first to jump up to testify. There is such a desire to be a contributing citizen again, and such isolation when you're a known perpetrator. This was the case in the village of Dabu, which was a rebel stronghold during the Civil War. Right after the introductions from the local chief, the first person to jump up was a gentleman named Michael, who had been a rebel during the war. When the rebels came into town, everybody that fled, they had oftentimes buried their food. One family escaped except for their 7-year-old daughter who was captured by the rebels. Michael tied her to a chair. They beat her to try to get her to tell them where they had buried their food, and she wouldn't tell them, and they beat her so badly that she died. And since that time, Michael and the mother of this child, whose name is Mariama, had lived literally next door to each other in this village of Dabu and had never talked about what happened. Michael was the first one to jump forward to tell his story. The facilitators asked if the woman he had harmed was there, and she jumped up. And Michael bowed to her, which is this traditional Sierra Leonean gesture of apology. And she tapped his head, the gesture of forgiveness, and acknowledged that she forgave him. And they embraced. It's an extraordinary moment and almost difficult to absorb and comprehend. But when we interviewed them for the film the next day, Mariama, when asked, how can you forgive him? Like it almost feels like somebody's telling her to do this. She leaned back and she goes, we can think for ourselves on these things. And she just had such a clear sense that she could never move on until she had forgiven him. Now that he had acknowledged it, and the community could never move on until they had the truths of what had happened had been brought forward, and there was an apology and a forgiveness. So the direct link from forgiveness to development, and we heard from everybody, we can't develop until we have peace. And we can't have peace until we reconcile. They knew they had to reconcile. In that context, it enabled them to work together. Michael made every effort after that ceremony to carry water for her, do chores her daughter might have been doing had she still been alive, and to help her and to work side by side in the community fields so that they could grow the food that would support not only them, but really their whole community. And I think that's a phenomenal story. That was one testimony of about 10 in that village that night. The next day, they had a cleansing ceremony that brought in the ancestors, a big part of Sierra Leonean culture.
How long does a cleansing ceremony take? And can you describe it a little bit?
They would be different because the traditions vary by local culture and context. One example, this was in a small town in Eastern Carolina called Bangbakordu. For their cleansing ceremony, they gathered in the morning, and everybody who had testified at the bonfire the last night sat down, and they had somebody that is like a local shaman, and he had like fronds the palm fronds and dipped them in water as a part of the ceremony and sprinkled them on everybody that testified. And they went over to different parts of the land where there had been, say, a mass grave and did a similar sort of cleansing ceremony there. Or if there had been other places where atrocities had taken place. That was part of it. And then they had a ritual slaughter of, I think it was a cow in that area as part of their cleansing ceremony that then led to a community feast where they came together and ate together from the same bowl and celebrated and stayed up dancing and singing. That was one example of a cleansing ceremony in that culture. And a lot of them were similar in spirit, if not in detail.
Some of the things that I'm hearing from you and that I've read that really helped is that Sierra Leoneans already had some kind of culture of forgiveness. Right. So that was incorporated in who they were, and they had a strong sense of what it meant to be part of a community.
Yeah.
To be outside of that was painful.
Yeah.
That's something we need to build into our Western society. One of the stories in the documentary talked about Tamba Joe and the sister of Tamba Joe and Captain Savage. Could you share that story?
Mohammed Savage was one of the most notorious commanders in the Civil War. Many say if they had indicted 14 people in the special court proceedings instead of 13, he would have been the next one. But there was an area of Kono, which is the diamond mining district in Sierra Leone, where he was from and was where a lot of his command had taken place. It was so notorious for his gruesome mass killings. There was a mass grave named after him called Savage Pit. It was a pond, and it was known as the place where they buried the decapitated heads or bodies of the people that he had killed. And in that community, there was one small town where one of their own had become a rather notorious leader of the atrocities and had killed and beheaded 17 members of his own family. And his name was Tamba Joe. And when Fambul Tok went to that community, there was a lot of discussion about whether they even wanted to have a bonfire. But universally, they felt like they will never be able to move forward until they're able to really talk about what happened. So they spent months searching for Tamba Joe. They decided they wanted to have Tamba Joe come back and apologize or acknowledge or be there. So they prepared for the ceremony and searched all over the country, high and low, for Tamba Joe to let him know that he would be welcome back to testify. At the ceremony, Tamba Joe didn't show up. Nobody could find him. They don't know where he is. The suspicion was that he was out of the country or possibly dead. But his sisters were there. When the father of many of the victims stood up to talk about what had happened to his children, when it was clear that Tamba Joe wasn't there, the sisters came forward to testify and apologize on his behalf. Naomi Joe was one of those sisters. They apologized, and the father who was testifying forgave them. They walked off together arm in arm, somberly. That gave the community a measure of forward movement, I would say, a beginnings of a healing process, an agreement to work together. Naomi Joe and her sisters wanted Tamba Joe to come back. After this experience, Naomi had a message for her brother, just letting him know that, reminding him that we have this culture of community, and this was a time to repair the community, and he could come home, he would be welcomed and forgiven.
I could actually read that message because there's more to the story. Would this be a good time?
I think her words are so poetic. That would be beautiful.
This is the message Naomi Joe was trying to get to her brother to encourage him to come back. She said, "Don't be afraid. Anything can happen for us, and everything has an end. There is time for crying, time for death, time for happiness. I believe with our apology at the bonfire for the role you played, I feel that we've been wherever you are. You should not be afraid to come home. But if you're not ready, let there at least be some communication between us. Now we have taken the responsibility to work together as a family. We have lost enough of our relatives. Our mother is dead. Our father is dead. Our cousins have died. Even our children have died in this war. A lot of them. Please come home so that we can do some cleansing and sacrifices to all who died. That is all I have to say.
It was moving to hear you read it. Thank you. It shows how deeply valued family is and community, and family as community. They're not glossing over the horrors of what happened. You can hear that in Naomi's words. They're acknowledging even with those horrors, they can move forward to a better place. That is the humble and powerful invitation Naomi is offering.
The story continues that this message got to Captain Savage. Can you talk about that?
Mohammed Savage had been in prison for other crimes and had recently gotten out of prison right around the same time as the bonfire in Foindor, where Tamba Joe had been hoping that he would come forward. And so the film crew went with John Cocker to meet him and let him know that the Fambul Tok was happening. He could go back and apologize. And at first he totally denied that he was even Mohammed Savage or that Mohammed Savage. And it was a lengthy series of conversations and persistence. And finally, the film crew took this message from Naomi Joe that was intended for Tamba Joe and just showed it to Mohammed Savage. And as he watched it, again, at first, he denied that he was the Savage. But that night he called John and said, "Come back, I want to talk." And the next morning, he acknowledged who he was and felt Naomi's message to Tamba Joe was a message to him, that it was the invitation to him to come back, that he could acknowledge what he had done and be a part of helping to heal the communities where he had caused so much harm. And he wanted to do that. 18 months later, he was actually able to go back and have a special bonfire just for him, where he came face to face with many people he had harmed and apologized. It's an incredible story because not only did he then commit to going back and engaging in that community in constructive ways, but he actually became a member of the Fambul Tok staff and began to work with other ex-combatants using his own story to help them come to terms with the harms they had inflicted and to engage in the reconciliation process.
That is just so powerful and speaks to the power of forgiveness and for communities to hold people accountable and at the same time say, "We want you back."
Yeah.
What can we learn from the Fambul Tok process, which can be applied to community healing here in the United States?
I want to hold up and magnify the power of community. Ugandan Archbishop MacLeod Achola, his whole family was killed in the Civil War in Uganda. He talked about if you're holding something hot, like the truth is like fire, you need a strong container to hold it in. And that, he said, was mercy. Mercy is a strong enough container to hold the heat of the truth of what happened in their civil war. In Sierra Leone, that container was actually the community. That having a community that was whole, that was where people were working together and committed to the hard conversations together, acknowledging the truth of harms in front of the community could be a strong enough container to hold even the heat of the egregious harms, such as those of the Civil War in Sierra Leone. And it really proved to be. Not dealing with those issues was holding the communities, the power of community, and what it takes to create a space that supports the really difficult, hard conversations. Fambul Tok, as family talk, has become synonymous with hard conversations. Another language, another phrase that they use is frank talk. And so what does it take to create the space for frank talk? And Fambul Tok invested a lot in the work of creating the space that makes it safe for that kind of really difficult, hard conversation. And I think that process of creating the space and the containers for those conversations is really applicable across settings, and understanding the power of what's possible when you do come together as a community with those common commitments. It's just simply the commitment to go forward together and the space to do it. I think those lessons have a lot. And even beyond the forgiveness part of it, how much communities can do on their own with their own energies and resources when they come together and work together.
Is there anyone actually trying to apply these principles of Fambul Tok in the US?
Yeah, there have been several. First in Minneapolis, after the George Floyd murder, we worked with several folks doing community organization there. We worked with schools. There was a fairly sizable schools program, and schools are really good places to do restorative justice processes because classrooms and classes are built in communities. I just learned about a community in St. Louis that's addressing injustices and conflict in their own community, and they've drawn on the Fambul Tok model. We've been working with a team from Chicago addressing violence interruption. The Chicago government has just passed a pioneering co-governance framework, giving power to the communities to address their own issues, lead and come together to do it. They're drawing on principles similar to Fambul Tok. So the ideas are transferable.
There must be some kind of preparation. What does it look like, actually?
I can answer that. What does it look like? Because the applications are much less direct. One of the core principles is it has to be led by the people in the context. Every context is different. I can share an example of a school in Philadelphia. I gave a talk at a middle school in Philadelphia. In the sixth grade classroom, there had been a conflict all year long. One of the teachers had left suddenly, and it impacted the whole environment. There was just, the classes weren't getting along, and the teachers felt like it was impacting the whole learning experience. After this talk, that class was on a field trip, and it broke out into a fight. One of the students reached out and hit another student, and it devolved. And there was a third student who said, wait a minute. Okay, let's not go get the teachers. Let's sit down right now and talk this through. They talked about what had happened and they solved it. And this one little boy raised his hand. He goes, hey, we just had our own Fambul Tok. They went back into their classroom the next morning. The teachers obviously had heard about what happened, and they sat the class down in a circle and they went around and gave every kid the chance to speak. And after 2 hours, everyone had spoken. Almost everyone had cried. And they just felt like it had given them the space to air what needed to be aired, to reconnect with what each of them wanted in a deeper way, and to figure out how they could work together to not only prevent the disruption from happening, but to more actively support each other as a community going forward. And it completely changed the rest of their year. They started a Fambul Tok club in their school, led programs for the whole school, and then led in sharing this approach with other schools in Philadelphia and then ultimately nationally. Kids get it.
They do a better job at getting it than some adults, I would say.
Yes.
What would you like to leave this audience with?
I think there is so much more good possible. I've been working in Sierra Leone for 18 years, and from the beginning, I've been astonished at how much good is possible. The flip side is that so much of our efforts to try to help actually make things worse. And we need to learn different ways of helping that are really rooted in this fundamental understanding that the answers are there. The communities have the answers to the challenges that they're facing, and the role of somebody who wants to come in to help isn't to go in and bring the expertise and the ideas. It's to hold the space, to invite the answers that are there to come forward, to mirror them back, to magnify them out, and to build from them. So much more good is possible than we think. My imagination gets challenged to let go of internalized assumptions of scarcity or despair that change is ever possible. So much is possible, especially when we come together.
How can people reach you?
I would say, read my book. The answers are there, Building Peace from the Inside Out. Watch the Fambul Tok film. It's available. My author website is libbyhoffman.com, and links to all of the other resources are there. You can reach me through that or the Catalyst for Peace website and find us and our work there. And we'll look forward to forwarding the conversation, seeing how it wants to grow.
That would be great. This will be in the show notes so everybody can see all of this. I second reading your book, that wonderful approach of inside out,
Yeah.
which the more I think about it, the more I recognize the profoundness. Thank you, Libby, for such an insightful and uplifting conversation. I appreciate you and what you bring to this whole field of peace building. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. I'm really grateful. You're gathering and sharing these stories. This is exactly what we need. I look forward to hearing the other stories and interviews and learning more about all the good that is possible.
My dream with this podcast is to get everybody listening to start thinking about new ways of interacting with one another, building community. Hopefully this can help start our healing process so we can come back together as one people and where all voices are heard, accepted, and respected. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in listening to Political Forgiveness, Voices of Peace, where I hope you were inspired by the work of forgiveness in creating social change. If you know of anyone who would find this episode helpful, please share it. For more information on political forgiveness, please visit my website, drboris.com, where you can find all the resources mentioned in the podcast, as well as sign up for the newsletter with the latest information on political forgiveness.